The nightlife in San Francisco is bustling, and we find ourselves at a local coffee shop. A giant cup of coffee is served to a man named Charlie, who is amazed at the size of the cup. Then, he turns his attention to his friend Tony. He doesn't understand why he has to look like an undercover cop trying to look cool. Tony changes the subject while Charlie broke up with Sherry, and he points out that paranoia is causing to break up with every girl that gets close. Eventually, it becomes Charlie's turn to get on stage to say his poem, and he's welcomed by the entire audience as he says a poem about his past heartbreaks. The next day, Charlie drives around town to find a local butcher, and Harriet comes to the front to serve him. Charlie purchases some haggis, and Harriet seems a little sad that that's all he wants. When Charlie gets home, his parents are dancing a jig, and everyone gathers for the soccer game. While Charlie helps his mom with the cooking, she finds out that he broke up with Sherry, and she seems surprised since they were so good together. He opens up about how marriage terrifies him, and she thinks that might be okay after reading something in the paper. She grabs the paper to show him an article about Mrs. X, the honeymoon murderer, who is a killer who marries men and kills them. By the end of the night, Tony and Charlie say their goodbyes, and the next day, Charlie spots Harriet outside of the butcher shop. At the police station, Tony gets to work, and he opens up about how disappointed he is about how boring being a cop really is. Later, Charlie makes his way back to the butcher shop, and he decides to pop inside to see how Harriet is doing. It turns out that she's really busy, and Charlie points out that his father used to be a butcher. After hearing this, Harriet has him help her with the customers, which goes very well and leads to a fun day. Later, the two of them head out for a hot dog. Harriet thanks him for helping out, and Charlie tries to turn the conversation around to her. He asks her what some of the most evil things that she's done, and she gives him a nice runaround answer. As they continue their evening, Charlie finds out that she also speaks Russian, and Harriet tries to find out more about what Charlie looks for in a woman. They dance a nice little ballet in the square, and Charlie comes over to her place afterwards. As Charlie looks around, he notices quite a few interesting pieces on her walls, and Harriet gives him some more runaround answers when he asks where she got it. Charlie starts to think that he might need to take things slow right now, but when Harriet shows that she's not worried about that, Charlie forgets all about that as well. While Harriet sleeps, Charlie hears her call out for Ralph, and he soothes her. When he tells her what she was saying, Harriet tells him that Ralph is her female friend, and Charlie starts having some doubts. When they wake up in the morning, Charlie goes to the bathroom to surprise Harriet in the shower, but it ends up being Harriet's sister, Rose. After getting dressed, he comes downstairs to find Rose on the couch, and she makes him breakfast. While they sit at the table, Rose gives Charlie an uneasy feeling while talking about Harriet's past, and she says goodbye by telling him that he needs to be careful. After that chilling morning experience, Charlie meets up with Tony on the police boat, and they take a tour of Alcatraz prison. Vicky is their tour guide, and Charlie seems to be more focused on Harriet. He tells Tony that this time around, he's going to ignore his paranoias, and he's not going to let them ruin his happiness. Charlie explains that he really does feel happy with Harriet, and he has Tony agree to help him not screw it up this time. In the coming weeks, Charlie and Harriet share a bunch of happy moments, and some of those include Rose as well. One rainy night, Charlie and Harriet meet up with Tony and his girlfriend, Susan. Once they're done with their evening, Tony and Susan grab a cab, and Harriet and Charlie prefer to walk home in the rain. Charlie tells Harriet that he's excited for her to meet his parents the next day, and she makes him a little worried when she mentions that she could see them being together forever. The next day, they head over to his parents' house, and Harriet sits down with his mother to look at baby pictures while Charlie goes to the bathroom. While he's in the bathroom, he notices the paper his mother told him about, and he notices a lot of similarities between Harriet and Mrs. X, including one of the victims being a martial artist, and another being named Ralph. On the drive home, Charlie asks her some leading questions, and her answers line up with everything that describes the honeymoon killer. That night in bed, Harriet calls out for Ralph again, and in the morning, Charlie takes the paper about Mrs. X to Tony, who thinks he's just being paranoid since he's getting serious with Harriet. After they have another officer look into the matter, she points out that none of the husbands were actually dead, and they were only found to be missing. That night, Charlie watches the news, and he hears a report about how poisoning crimes are on the rise. Just then, Harriet comes home with a homemade shake. and he does everything he can to avoid drinking it. When they lay down for the night, Harriet mentions how much they trust each other, and she playfully brings up some awful things that she could do to him. But Charlie thinks that she's foreshadowing her own future crimes. The next day, Charlie makes his way to the local paper, and he requests to put in a message in there for his parents' anniversary. Suddenly, the area that works on deaths mentions that they finally found Ralph's body, and Charlie finds out that they never found any news on the wife. This is enough to confirm his suspicions, and he breaks up with Harriet later that day. That night, Charlie sits by the water to try and write a new poem about Harriet, and he heads to the cafe to perform his new poem. He starts off like normal, but in the end, he realizes that he really does still love her. The next day, Tony calls Charlie from a payphone to tell him that someone came forward to admit to the murder of Ralph, and Charlie rushes over to apologize to Harriet. Harriet answers the door to see what he wants, and she tells him that he'll just end up leaving her again. Charlie assures her that he just got scared because things were going so well, and he tells her that he loves her. She tells him that she loves him too, but he blew it. Charlie isn't done though. He has the band from the cafe play for him from a neighborhood rooftop as he reads a poem to Harriet. Harriet calls him over to the window, and she lets him back in. The two of them bathe together, and suddenly, Rose comes to the door to tell her that she has a visitor. When Charlie comes down in his bathrobe, he's introduced to Harriet's friend, Ralph, and he has a slight wardrobe malfunction. Later, it's time to celebrate the anniversary of Charlie's parents, and everyone dances after a touching toast from Charlie's father. When Charlie and Harriet get up to dance, Charlie tells Harriet that he wants to marry her, but Harriet thinks that that isn't a good idea. Charlie opens up about his plans for a future with her, and Harriet eventually changes her mind. Soon, the two of them get married, but during the reception, Harriet starts showing signs of Mrs. X again. Next, the happy couple goes on their honeymoon, but back at the precinct, the captain barges into Tony's office because he heard that he was showing interest in the Ralph homicide. The captain points out that the woman who came forward to admit to the murder in the first place ended up being a nutcase who admitted to the death of Abraham Lincoln as well. Tony rushes out to ask key witnesses from the other three murders if the picture of Harriet looks like Mrs. X, and they confirm that she's the same woman. Meanwhile, when Charlie and Harriet reach their destination, they find out that a storm is coming through that evening, and Harriet goes to the hotel pharmacy. That evening, we see her dipping the rings in a powder, and Tony is chartering a plane to make it to the hotel in time to stop Harriet. At dinner, Charlie and Harriet head downstairs for their dinner reservation, but they're interrupted when Tony manages to get a phone call to him. Tony warns him that Harriet is Mrs. X, but the power lines go out just when he's about to tell him what to do. Tony tries to commandeer a man's vehicle, but this guy is playing hardball. Back at the hotel, Charlie and Harriet are carried to the bedroom, and Harriet has an axe waiting for her. She tells him that she has something to tell him, and she admits to being married before. Charlie grabs the axe, and he warns her to stay away. The power goes out, and Harriet hops on Charlie to plead with him not to go. Meanwhile, Tony manages to hitch a ride with the man he tried to get the car from, but they aren't the best pair to be stuck together. Back at the hotel, Charlie locks Harriet in the bathroom, and he notices a note that was supposedly written by him. Just then, Rose appears and attacks him with the axe. She blames him for taking Harriet away, and the chase ends up on the roof of the hotel. Tony makes it to the hotel, breaks down the door, and finds Harriet locked in the closet. After he lets her out, she tries to lead him to the roof, but he arrests her instead. While Charlie fights for his life on the roof, Tony interrogates Harriet. Eventually, Charlie's fight ends up with him holding onto Rose as she dangles over the edge. Tony makes his way to the roof in time to rescue her. She's brought to the ground and arrested for all the murders. Back in town, Charlie performs his poem about Harriet, and the two of them live happily together. 90s comedies wouldn't have been the same without Mike Myers' contribution, and So I Married an Axe Murderer was one of his greatest. And that wraps up this recap. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this recap, please subscribe with notifications turned on so you don't miss a single video.